hand slammed down on Alira's wrist before her fingers could close around the loaf of bread lying in the mud. "Thieving rat," the guard said, twisting her arm until she dropped to her knees on the cold stone of the market square. Laughter rippled through the crowd gathered around the stalls of Ashfell. Merchants leaned out from behind their carts to watch. Children pointed. A woman selling apples shook her head and muttered that the beggar girl deserved worse than a twisted wrist. Alira did not cry out. She had learned long ago that tears only made people laugh harder. She kept her eyes down, staring at the bread half buried in the mud, the bread that had fallen from a merchant's cart only moments before, the bread nobody else had wanted until she reached for it. "Please," she said quietly. "I only wanted what was already lost." The guard, a broad man named Garrick who worked for the bread merchant Oswin, sneered and shoved her backward. She fell against the wheel of a cart, and the crowd laughed again. Someone threw a rotten turnip that struck her shoulder. She did not flinch. She had grown used to being struck by more than words. For 3 years, Alira had lived on the edges of Ashfell, sleeping in the shell of an old grain store behind the tannery, sweeping the steps of shops that never paid her, and eating whatever scraps the town was willing to throw away. The people of Ashfell called her many things: the beggar girl, the cursed one, the girl with no name and no family. None of them knew her real name, and she made sure of that. She had buried it the same night she buried everything else she once had. Beneath the frayed sleeve of her tunic, hidden against her skin, she wore a thin ring on a cord around her neck. It was old, dulled by years of hiding, but if anyone looked closely enough, they would see a small crest pressed into the metal, a hawk with wings spread wide over a shield. She never let anyone look closely enough. "Get up," Garrick said, nudging her with his boot. "And don't let me catch you near the stalls again, or next time I won't be so gentle." Alira rose slowly, brushing the mud from her knees, saying nothing. She had learned that silence was safer than defending herself. Words only gave people more reasons to strike. She turned to walk away, back toward the alley where she slept, when the sound of horns cut through the noise of the square. Every head turned. The chatter of the market died down into a low murmur of surprise. A line of riders entered the town gates, banners snapping in the wind. The crest on those banners was unmistakable to anyone who had ever traveled north. A silver wolf standing over a mountain peak, the mark of House Voss, rulers of the northern territories. Behind the riders came a long convoy of wagons, soldiers in polished armor, and finally, drawn by 4 black horses, an ornate carriage trimmed in silver. Ashfell rarely saw visitors of importance. The town sat at the edge of the trade roads, useful only as a place to rest horses and restock supplies, before continuing toward the capital, or further north, into the Duke's territory. But today, it seemed, the convoy of the Northern Duke himself had chosen to stop. The market square, moments ago filled with laughter at Alira's expense, transformed instantly. Merchants straightened their stalls. Guards stood taller. Women pulled their children close and smoothed their hair. Everyone wanted to appear presentable before the soldiers of a duke. Alira used the distraction to slip toward the shadows of a nearby building, intending to disappear before anyone remembered she existed. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but hunger was nothing new. She had survived worse days than this one. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall of a bakery and watched as the convoy came to a stop in the center of the square. Soldiers dismounted with practiced precision, forming a loose perimeter around the carriage. The townsfolk began to gather at a respectful distance, whispering amongst themselves, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever traveled inside such a grand carriage. "They say the Duke himself travels with this convoy," a woman near Alira whispered to her companion. "Come to inspect the northern trade roads before winter." "The Duke of Voss," the other woman replied, her voice hushed with a mixture of fear and excitement. "They say he has no mercy for those who waste his time, and no patience for weakness." Alira felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. She knew enough about Duke Cassian Voss from years of overheard conversations in taverns and market squares. He was known as a cold and calculating ruler, a man who had expanded his territory through strategy rather than kindness, who was said to trust no one and forgive nothing. Some called him ruthless, others called him just. Few dared call him anything at all when there was a chance he might hear. She should have left then. She should have slipped away through the narrow gap between the bakery and the tannery, back to the safety of her hidden corner of the grain store, and waited for the convoy to leave, the way convoys always did, taking their soldiers and their banners and their danger with them. But her stomach ached, and the bread merchant Oswin had set up a new display of loaves not far from where the convoy had stopped, the soldiers momentarily distracting the merchant from his stall. It was foolish. She knew it was foolish even as her feet carried her closer. She reached the edge of the stall just as Oswin turned his attention to greet an approaching soldier, bowing low, eager to impress. In that single unguarded moment, Elira's hand shot out and closed around a small loaf resting at the edge of the table. She never made it 3 steps before the same guard from before, Garrick, spotted her and lunged, this time catching her arm so hard she cried out despite herself. The loaf fell from her fingers and rolled across the cobblestones, coming to rest near the polished boots of one of the Duke's own soldiers. "Caught her again," Garrick announced loudly, dragging Elira forward so the gathering crowd could see. "This one never learns. Thieving little beggar, always causing trouble in this square." The crowd, emboldened by the presence of the Duke's soldiers, found new courage to mock her. Someone called out that she should be thrown from the town gates. Another suggested her hand be marked so every merchant would know to watch her. Laughter spread through the square like fire through dry grass, and Elira stood in the center of it, her wrist throbbing in Garrick's grip, her cheeks burning with a shame she refused to let show on her face. She had endured this before. She told herself she could endure it again. She fixed her eyes on a point in the distance, somewhere beyond the crowd, beyond the mockery, and waited for it to pass the way storms always eventually passed. It was then that the carriage door opened. The crowd's laughter faltered and died as a figure stepped down from the ornate carriage, dressed in a dark coat trimmed with silver thread, his boots striking the cobblestones with the quiet authority of a man used to rooms falling silent when he entered them. His hair was black, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp enough to make even the soldiers around him stand a little straighter. Duke Cassian Voss surveyed the scene before him with the calm patience of a predator observing its surroundings, missing nothing. His gaze passed over the merchant, over the guard still gripping Elira's arm, over the crowd eager for entertainment, and finally settled on Elira herself. Something in his expression shifted, so subtle that most of the crowd did not notice it at all. A narrowing of the eyes, a pause, as if he had seen something unexpected in a place he had not thought to look. "Release her," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the square with an authority that needed no volume. Garrick's grip loosened instantly, though confusion crossed his face. "Your Grace, this girl has been caught stealing from the merchant's stall. She is nothing but a beggar who causes trouble in this square." The Duke did not respond to Garrick. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes still fixed on Elira, studying her with an intensity that made her want to shrink back into the shadows where she had come from. She resisted the urge to look away. Something told her that looking away now would be a mistake, though she could not explain why. "Your name," the Duke said, his voice even, giving nothing away. Elira hesitated. In 3 years, no one had asked for her name. No one had cared enough to want it. She had almost forgotten how strange it felt to be seen as something more than a nuisance to be shooed away. "Elira," she said finally, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. It was not a lie, not entirely. It was the only name she allowed herself to answer to now. The Duke's eyes moved briefly to her hands, to the frayed collar of her tunic, and lingered for a fraction of a second on the thin cord visible at her throat, the one that disappeared beneath her clothing, where the hidden ring rested against her skin. Elira's breath caught. No one had ever noticed the cord before. No one had ever looked closely enough to see it. "Elira," the Duke repeated slowly, as though testing the shape of the word. "And how long have you lived in this town?" 3 years, Your Grace," she answered, unsure why he cared, unsure why the crowd around them had gone so silent, unsure why her hands had begun to tremble, though she had faced far worse humiliation than this without flinching. The Duke said nothing further. He simply turned to one of his soldiers, a tall man with a scar along his jaw, and spoke in a low voice that Elira could not hear. The soldier nodded once and stepped forward, taking hold of Elira's arm, though far more gently than Garrick ever had.
"What is happening?" Elira asked, alarm creeping into her voice for the first time.
"I have done nothing but take a piece of bread that had already fallen. Please, I meant no harm." "You are coming with us," the soldier said simply, offering no further explanation. The crowd, moments ago eager to see her punished, now stood in stunned silence, whispering amongst themselves, confused by the sudden turn of events. Oswin the merchant looked as though he wanted to protest but thought better of it when he saw the expression on the Duke's face. Garrick simply stepped back, his earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. Alira's mind raced. She thought of running, of twisting free from the soldier's grip, and disappearing into the alleys she knew so well, the way she had escaped danger so many times before. But something about the way the Duke looked at her, the way his eyes had lingered on the cord around her neck, told her that running would not save her this time. Whatever he had seen, whatever had caught his attention, it was already too late to hide from it. "Your Grace," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, even as fear coiled tight in her chest. "What do you want with me? I am no one. I have nothing you could possibly need." For the first time, something that might have been the faintest trace of a smile touched the corner of the Duke's mouth, though it held no warmth, only calculation, the expression of a man who had just discovered something valuable in a place no one else had thought to search. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely what we are going to find out." He turned without another word and walked back toward his carriage, leaving Alira standing in the grip of his soldier, the eyes of the entire square fixed upon her, the bread she had risked everything to steal, still lying forgotten in the mud at her feet. As the soldier led her toward one of the convoy's wagons, Alira glanced back one last time at the life she was leaving behind, the alley where she had slept for 3 years, the market square where she had been mocked and struck and ignored. She did not know what waited for her at the end of this road, whether it would bring her closer to death, or to something she had buried so deep, she had almost convinced herself it never existed at all. The wagon door closed behind her, and the convoy began to move, carrying her north, away from Ashfell, away from everything she had known, toward a truth she was not yet ready to face. The wagon jolted over uneven road, and Alira gripped the wooden bench beneath her, watching the walls of Ashfell shrink behind them, through a narrow gap in the canvas covering. She had never traveled beyond the town in 3 years. Before that, she had traveled so much and so fast that the memories blurred into a single long night of running. The soldier who had led her from the square sat across from her, silent, his scarred face giving nothing away. He did not look at her the way Garrick had, with contempt, nor the way the crowd had, with cruel amusement. He simply watched the road behind them through the gap in the canvas, alert, as though danger might follow even here. "Where are you taking me?" Alira asked, breaking the silence after what felt like an hour of travel. "North," the soldier answered, "to the Duke's keep." "Why?" The soldier's eyes flicked toward her for the briefest moment. "That is not mine to say." Alira pressed her lips together and looked away, out through the gap in the canvas at the passing countryside, fields turning gold and brown with the approach of winter. Fear still coiled in her chest, but beneath it, something else had begun to stir, something she had not felt in years and had trained herself not to feel at all. Curiosity, hope, perhaps, though she refused to name it that. She thought of the ring hidden beneath her tunic, resting against her skin on its worn cord. She had worn it every day since the night everything changed, never removing it, never showing it to anyone, not even in her sleep. It was the only thing she had left of who she used to be, and she had guarded it more carefully than she had ever guarded her own safety. The Duke had seen it. She was certain of that now, replaying the moment in her mind, the way his eyes had paused on her throat before moving to her face. No one looked that carefully, unless they recognized what they saw. The wagon rocked to a gentle stop as the convoy paused to rest the horses. Alira heard voices outside, soldiers speaking in low tones, the creak of wagon wheels, the distant call of a bird overhead. The soldier across from her rose and stepped down from the wagon, and a moment later, another figure climbed up to take his place. It was a young woman, perhaps a few years older than Alira, dressed in a simple gray dress with an apron tied over it, her dark hair pulled back into a neat braid. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, which she set down on the bench beside her, before looking up at Alira with an expression that held none of the mockery Alira had grown used to seeing on the faces of strangers. "My name is Leora," the woman said. "I serve in the Duke's household. I have brought you some food and water, if you would like it." Alira stared at her, unsure how to respond to kindness offered so plainly, without demand for anything in return. It had been so long since anyone had simply offered her something without expecting mockery or payment that she almost did not know how to accept it. "Thank you," she finally said, taking the bundle with hands that trembled slightly. Inside, she found bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and a small flask of water. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of Leora watching her with quiet curiosity, but no judgment. "You are wondering why I have been brought here," Elira said eventually, unable to bear the silence any longer. Leora hesitated, glancing toward the front of the wagon, as though checking that no one else could hear. "I do not know the full reason," she admitted. "But I overheard the Duke speaking with his steward before we left Ashfell. He mentioned a name, Thorn." Elira's hand froze halfway to her mouth, the bread forgotten. The name struck her like a physical blow, though Leora could not have known the weight it carried. Thorn. A name Elira had not heard spoken aloud in 3 years. A name she had buried, along with everything else, on the night her family fell. "Does that name mean something to you?" Leora asked, noticing the sudden change in Elira's expression. Leora forced herself to breathe evenly, to arrange her features back into careful neutrality, the mask she had perfected over years of hiding. "No," she lied, "I have never heard it before." Leora did not press further, though something in her eyes suggested she did not entirely believe the lie. She simply nodded and busied herself folding the empty cloth that had held the food, giving Elira a moment to compose herself. But Elira's mind had already left the wagon, traveling backward through years she had tried so hard to forget. She saw her father's study, filled with books and maps, the warm light of candles reflecting off the crest that hung above the fireplace, a hawk with wings spread wide over a shield, the same crest pressed into the ring she now wore hidden against her skin. She saw her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair before a feast, the sound of her younger brother's laughter echoing through the halls of a home that no longer existed. And she saw the fire, the screaming, the soldiers bearing a crest she had trained herself never to think of again, storming through the halls in the dead of night, cutting down everyone who bore the name Thorn or served those who did. She had been 12 years old. She remembered running through smoke-filled corridors, her mother's hand gripping hers so tightly it left bruises, her father's voice calling out from somewhere behind them, telling them to run and not look back no matter what they heard. She had looked back, just once, and what she saw in that single glance had haunted every night since. She had run alone after that, hiding in forests, begging in villages too small to ask questions, moving from town to town whenever anyone looked at her too closely, until 3 years ago, exhausted and starving, she had collapsed on the edge of Ashfell and simply stopped running, deciding that if death wanted to find her, it could find her there as easily as anywhere else. But death had not found her. Only mockery, and hunger, and years of quiet survival that asked nothing of her except endurance. Now, it seemed, the name she had buried so deeply had somehow reached the ears of a duke powerful enough to command soldiers and convoys and the fear of an entire town. She did not know how, and she did not know why, but she understood one thing with sudden, sharp clarity. Whatever the duke wanted with her, it was connected to a past she had spent 3 years trying to erase. "Are you well?" Leora asked gently, noticing that Elira had gone pale. "I am tired," Elira said, which was true enough, though not for the reasons Leora likely assumed. "It has been a difficult day." Leora nodded with understanding and did not ask further questions, though she remained close, offering quiet company for the remainder of the journey, as the convoy resumed its march north. Elira watched the changing landscape through the gap in the canvas, forests giving way to rolling hills, the air growing colder as they traveled further from Ashfell. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, the wagon slowed once more, and Elira heard murmurs of excitement pass through the convoy outside. She leaned toward the gap in the canvas and saw it in the distance, a great fortress rising from the hills, its towers dark against the darkening sky, torches already being lit along its high walls. The northern keep of House Voss. "We have arrived," Leora said quietly, gathering her things. Elira's heart pounded as the convoy approached the massive gates of the fortress, guards calling out greetings and orders as the wagons rolled through into a wide courtyard lit by torchlight. She had spent 3 years trying to become invisible, to matter to no one, to be forgotten by a world that had already taken everything from her. Now she was being led directly into the heart of one of the most powerful houses in the entire Northern Territory, and she had no idea whether she was walking toward safety or toward the very danger she had spent so long running from. The wagon came to a final stop, and the canvas flap was pulled back, revealing the courtyard beyond, filled with soldiers, servants, and the flickering light of countless torches. Leora stepped down first, then turned and offered Alira her hand. "Come," she said gently. "The Duke is waiting." Alira hesitated only a moment before taking the offered hand and stepping down from the wagon into the courtyard of the Northern Duke's keep, the cold night air settling around her like a warning she could not yet understand. Somewhere within those high stone walls, answers waited for her, answers she had spent 3 years running from and could no longer avoid. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, and followed Leora across the courtyard toward the great doors of the keep, unaware that behind those doors, a truth long buried was about to be pulled into the light, one that would change everything she thought she knew about who she was and what remained of the family she believed she had lost forever. The great hall of the keep was larger than any room Alira had ever stood inside. Tall windows lined the walls, dark now with the night outside, and torches burned in iron brackets, casting long shadows across the stone floor. A fire roared in a hearth wide enough to stand inside, warming the air despite the chill that clung to the corridors leading here. Duke Cassian Voss stood near the hearth when Leora led Alira inside, his hands clasped behind his back, his dark coat replaced now with a simpler tunic, though he still carried himself with the same unyielding authority he had shown in the market square of Ashfell. Beside him stood an older man with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard, dressed in the fine robes of a steward, a thick leather folder tucked beneath his arm. "Leave us," the Duke said to Leora, who bowed quickly and slipped from the room, though not before offering Alira a brief, reassuring glance. The doors closed with a heavy sound that echoed through the hall, leaving Alira alone with the Duke and his steward, the fire crackling as the only sound to break the silence. She stood near the entrance, unwilling to move closer, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their trembling. "You must have questions," the Duke said finally, turning to face her fully. "I have many," Alira admitted, her voice steadier than she felt, "but I suspect you have no intention of answering most of them." Something flickered across the Duke's face, an expression too brief to name, though it might have been the ghost of amusement. "I intend to answer more than you expect," he said. "Sit, please." He gestured toward a chair near the fire, and after a moment's hesitation, Alira crossed the room and sat, grateful for the warmth after the long, cold journey. The Duke remained standing, while the steward stepped forward, opening the leather folder he carried, and withdrawing several yellowed papers. "This is Doran," the Duke said, nodding toward the steward. "He has served my family for many years, and keeps records more thorough than most libraries." Doran offered Alira a small, polite bow before spreading the papers carefully on a nearby table. "Your Grace mentioned a ring," he said, looking toward Alira expectantly. Alira's hand rose instinctively toward her throat, though she stopped herself before touching the cord hidden beneath her collar. "I do not know what you mean," she said, though the lie felt hollow even to her own ears. The Duke stepped closer, his expression neither cruel nor gentle, simply patient, the look of a man accustomed to waiting for truths to surface on their own. "In the square today," he said, "I saw a cord around your neck, hidden beneath your collar. I have spent enough years studying old family crests to recognize the shape of what likely hangs from it, even without seeing it directly. A hawk, wings spread, over a shield." Alira's breath caught, and she felt the color drain from her face. She had been so careful, so certain that no one could see past the years of dirt and rags and quiet suffering, to notice something as small as a cord around her neck. Yet this stranger, this powerful Duke she had never met before today, had seen it in a single glance across a crowded market square. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered, though the question was really an admission, and both of them knew it. "Because I have seen that crest before," the Duke said quietly, "on a banner that once hung in a hall much like this one, many years ago, before it and everything beneath it burned." The room seemed to grow colder, despite the fire's warmth. Alira's hands gripped the arms of the chair, her knuckles white. "You knew House Thorn," she said, the name leaving her lips for the first time in 3 years, feeling strange and painful on her tongue.
"I knew of them," the Duke corrected gently.
"My father did business with Lord Edrin Thorn many years before I came into my title. I was young then, barely more than a boy, but I remember visiting Thorn Hall once with my father. I remember a small girl with dark hair who showed me her favorite hiding spot in the gardens, insisting it was a secret known only to her." Alira's eyes widened, memories stirring that she had thought lost entirely, buried beneath years of survival. A boy with serious eyes, visiting with his father, following her through the gardens while she proudly showed him the hollow beneath the old willow tree, where she liked to hide from her tutors. "That was you," she breathed, staring at the Duke as though seeing him for the first time, searching his features for traces of the boy she barely remembered. "It was," he confirmed. "Cassian Voss, though I doubt you remember my name specifically. Children rarely remember such details." "I remember the willow tree," Alira said softly, more to herself than to him. "I remember thinking you talked too seriously for someone so young." A faint smile touched the Duke's mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Some things do not change," he said, "but other things have changed a great deal, it seems, since that day in the gardens." Alira's momentary comfort faded, replaced once again by the weight of everything that had happened since. "You know what happened to my family," she said. It was not a question. The Duke's expression grew somber, and he glanced briefly at Doran before answering. "I know that House Thorn fell nearly 3 years ago, in a manner that was never fully explained to those outside the immediate circles of power. I know that it was reported the entire family perished, that no survivors were found in the wreckage of the estate. I have carried a quiet suspicion for years that the official reports were incomplete, though I had no proof and no reason to pursue the matter until today." "Why would you pursue it at all?" Alira asked, genuine confusion coloring her voice. "You said yourself, your father did business with mine. That hardly makes you responsible for uncovering the truth of what happened to us." The Duke was silent for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because my family owed yours a debt," he said finally. "One that predates even my own memory. Doran, if you would." Doran stepped forward, lifting one of the yellowed papers from the table and holding it toward Alira, though he did not yet hand it over. 20 years ago, he explained, before the current Duke came into his title, House Voss faced a crisis that nearly destroyed it entirely. A dispute over northern trade routes brought us to the edge of open conflict with 3 rival houses at once. Conflict that would have ruined this family financially and likely cost many lives. Lord Edrin Thorn, the Duke continued, intervened on our behalf, using his own influence and resources to broker peace between the houses, asking for nothing in return, except our word that House Voss would remember the debt, should the day ever come that House Thorn required our aid. Alira sat in stunned silence, absorbing information about her father she had never known. Memories of a man who had always seemed so quiet and reserved, revealed now to have quietly saved an entire noble house through diplomacy she had never witnessed. "By the time House Thorn fell," the Duke said, his voice tightening slightly with something that might have been regret, "I had only recently come into my title. I did not learn the full details of the attack until well after the fact, and by then, it was reported that no survivors remained. I honored my father's memory by mourning a debt I believed could never be repaid. Until today," Alira finished quietly. "Until today," the Duke agreed. The weight of the conversation settled over the room, and Alira found herself struggling to reconcile the girl she used to be, the daughter of Lord Edrin Thorn, with the beggar who had spent 3 years surviving on the scraps of Ashfell's mercy. The two identities felt like separate people entirely, connected only by the ring hidden beneath her collar, and the memories she had spent so long trying to forget. "What do you intend to do with this information?" Alira asked finally, forcing herself to meet the Duke's gaze directly. "I am no one now. Whatever debt your family owed mine, it was owed to a house that no longer exists. That," the Duke said, "depends entirely on what you choose to tell me. Doran has spent years researching the fall of House Thorn, more thoroughly than the official reports ever bothered to. But research alone cannot replace the truth only a survivor can provide." Alira closed her eyes briefly, the memories she had buried for 3 years threatening to surface all at once. The fire, the screaming, her mother's hand gripping hers as they ran through smoke-filled corridors. She had never spoken of that night to anyone, had never allowed herself to relive it in words rather than nightmares. "If I tell you what happened," she said slowly, opening her eyes to meet the Duke's steady gaze, "what happens to me afterward?" "That," the Duke said, "depends on what the truth reveals. But I will tell you this much now, so you understand exactly where you stand within these walls. Whatever you choose to share with me tonight, you will not be returned to Ashfell to beg in the streets and be struck by merchants' guards for the crime of hunger." Something in Alira's chest loosened slightly. A tension she had carried for so long, she had almost forgotten it was there. She looked toward the fire, gathering the courage to speak words she had never spoken aloud. And finally, quietly, she began to tell Duke Cassian Voss the story of the night. Everything she had once been was taken from her. "It happened in the autumn," Alira began, her voice quiet but steady, her eyes fixed on the flames rather than on the Duke or his steward. "I was 12 years old. My father had returned from a journey to the southern provinces only days earlier, and I remember he seemed troubled in a way I had never seen before, though he tried to hide it from my mother, and from me and my younger brother." The Duke lowered himself into a chair across from her, giving her space to speak, without the weight of his standing presence looming over the conversation. Doran remained near the table, quill in hand, though he made no move to write, simply listening with the same careful attention as his master. "He held a meeting with several men I did not recognize," Alira continued. "I remember watching from the top of the stairs, though I could not hear what was said. My mother sent me to bed early that night, which she rarely did. I thought at the time it was simply because of the visitors, but now I believe she already sensed something was wrong." She paused, gathering the strength to continue, memories she had kept locked away for so long, now rising to the surface with painful clarity. "I woke to the smell of smoke," she said. "At first I thought it was simply a fire in the hearth burning too high, but then I heard the screaming. My mother came into my room, already dressed, already pulling me from my bed, before I fully understood what was happening. She told me we needed to leave immediately, that I should not ask questions, only run." The fire crackled loudly in the silence that followed, and Alira wrapped her arms around herself, though the room was warm. "We found my brother in the hallway," she said. "He was only 8 years old. My mother took his hand in one of hers, and mine in the other, and we ran through corridors, filling with smoke, past rooms I did not recognize, because the smoke had already begun to change the shape of everything familiar. I heard my father's voice somewhere behind us, shouting orders to servants, though I could not make out the words over the sound of the fire, and the screaming that seemed to come from everywhere at once." "Did you see who attacked the estate?" the Duke asked gently, though the question clearly pained him to ask. Alira shook her head slowly, not clearly. "I saw soldiers, men in armor I did not recognize, moving through the halls with torches and blades. I saw them cut down servants who tried to flee, though I did not understand at the time what I was witnessing. I was 12. My mind refused to accept what my eyes were showing me." She fell silent for a long moment, and the Duke did not press her, allowing the silence to stretch, until she found the strength to continue on her own. "A servants' corridor, few people knew existed. One my father had shown me once as a game, insisting I remember it, in case I ever needed to escape quickly during a fire drill. I do not think he ever imagined it would be needed for anything worse than that. We nearly made it outside," she continued, her voice growing tighter with each word. "But soldiers found the passage before we could reach the gardens. My mother pushed my brother and me behind her, telling us to run toward the trees and not look back, no matter what we heard." Her hands trembled now, and she pressed them together in her lap, forcing herself to finish the memory she had carried alone for 3 years. "I looked back," she whispered, "just once. I saw my mother standing between us and the soldiers, and I saw—" She stopped, unable to complete the sentence, though the Duke's expression told her he understood well enough what she could not bring herself to say aloud. "You do not need to describe it further," the Duke said quietly, and something in his voice held genuine sympathy rather than mere formality. Alira nodded, grateful for the reprieve, though the memory remained vivid regardless of whether she spoke it aloud. "My brother and I ran into the forest," she continued after a moment. "We ran until we could no longer hear the screaming, until the smoke was only a distant glow behind us through the trees. We hid until morning, and when the sun rose, we tried to find our way back toward the road, hoping to find help." Her voice broke slightly, and she took a moment to steady herself before continuing. "We were separated during the second night," she said. "A group of soldiers found our hiding place near a stream. I do not know if they were the same soldiers from the estate, or others sent to search the surrounding lands. But they gave chase, and in the confusion, my brother and I became separated in the darkness. I called for him. I searched for hours. I never found him again." The weight of the confession settled heavily over the room. Doran had stopped pretending to hold his quill steady, and even the Duke's normally composed expression had softened into something that looked almost like grief. "I spent the following weeks moving from village to village," Elira said, her voice quieter now, exhausted from carrying the memory into words for the first time. "I did not use my real name. I did not tell anyone what had happened, fearing that whoever had attacked my family might still be searching for survivors. Eventually, I stopped moving and settled in Ashfell, believing it was small and unimportant enough that no one would think to look for me there." "And the ring?" the Duke asked gently, nodding toward the cord still hidden beneath her collar. Elira reached up finally and pulled the cord free, lifting it over her head and holding the ring in her open palm, for the first time, in front of another living person. The metal caught the firelight, the crest of the hawk and shield clearly visible, despite years of tarnish and wear. "It was my mother's," she said softly. "She placed it in my hand, the moment before she pushed us toward the trees. I believe she knew, even then, that she would not be following us." The Duke studied the ring carefully, without reaching to touch it, respecting the weight it clearly carried for the woman holding it. "Doran," he said finally, "does this match the records you have gathered?" Doran steepled forward, adjusting a pair of thin spectacles as he examined the ring from a respectful distance. "The crest matches perfectly, Your Grace," he confirmed. "This is without doubt the seal of House Thorn, a ring that would have belonged to the lady of the house herself, passed down through generations of Thorn women." The Duke nodded slowly, then turned his attention back to Elira, his expression grave but resolute. "Lady Elara Thorn," he said, using the name she had not heard spoken by another living soul in 3 long years. "I believe you may be the only surviving heir of a noble house that many believed had been entirely destroyed. If that is true, then what happened to your family was not merely an act of violence. It was a calculated destruction, one that likely served the interests of whoever stood to benefit from House Thorn's disappearance." Elira, who had spent 3 years believing herself utterly alone, utterly without purpose beyond simple survival, found herself trembling at the sound of her true name spoken aloud with such certainty and respect. It felt both familiar and foreign, a name that belonged to a girl who had died in the fire alongside her family, and yet here she sat, alive, holding the last remaining proof of who she truly was. "If what you say is true," she said slowly, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat, "then someone deliberately destroyed my family, and has believed for 3 years that they succeeded entirely. What happens now that you know they did not?" The Duke rose from his chair and moved to stand before the great hearth, his back to the fire, his expression settling into the calculating look Elira had first seen in the market square of Ashfell, though now it was directed not at her, but at whatever forces had orchestrated the fall of House Thorn. "Now," he said quietly, "we discover who benefited most from your family's destruction, and we ensure that they come to understand, in time, that their success was never as complete as they believed." Elira looked down at the ring in her palm, the last piece of a life she had thought forever lost, and felt something stir within her that she had not allowed herself to feel in 3 long years of quiet survival. Not merely hope, though hope was part of it, but something sharper, something closer to purpose. Justice, she realized, was a feeling she had almost forgotten how to want. Morning came slowly to the northern keep, gray light filtering through tall windows into a chamber far grander than any Elira had slept in since childhood. She woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was, her body expecting the hard floor of the grain store, rather than the softness of a proper bed. For a moment she lay still, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the fortress waking around her. Distant voices, the clatter of pots from a kitchen somewhere below, footsteps passing in corridors she had not yet learned to navigate. A soft knock at the door preceded Leora's entrance, carrying a tray with bread, fruit, and warm tea, along with a folded set of clothing draped over her arm. "Good morning," Leora said brightly, setting the tray down on a small table near the window. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in years," Elira admitted, sitting up slowly, still adjusting to the unfamiliar comfort surrounding her. "The Duke has asked that you join him and Doran in the study after you have eaten and dressed," Leora continued, laying out the clothing she had brought. A simple, but well-made dress in deep blue, far finer than anything Elira had worn since she was 12 years old. He mentioned there is much still to discuss. Elira touched the fabric of the dress hesitantly, feeling strangely out of place at the thought of wearing something so fine after years spent in rags. "This is generous," she said quietly. "More generous than I expected." "The Duke does not do things by half measures," Leora replied, a small smile touching her lips. "Whatever he decides, he commits to fully. I have served this household for many years, and I have rarely seen him take such personal interest in a matter as he has taken in yours." Elira said nothing to that, unsure how to respond, though the observation lingered in her mind as she washed and dressed, the fabric of the new gown feeling foreign against skin that had grown accustomed to rough, threadbare cloth. When she finally looked at her reflection in a small mirror hanging near the window, she almost did not recognize the woman staring back at her, hair combed smooth, dressed in clean, fine clothing, looking for the first time in years like someone who might have once been called a lady. She found her way to the study with Leora's guidance, and entered to find the Duke already seated at a large desk covered in papers, maps, and ledgers, Doran standing beside him, pointing towards something on one of the documents. Both men looked up as she entered, and the Duke rose immediately, a gesture of respect Elira had not expected and did not quite know how to receive. "Lady Alara," he said, and though she had heard the name spoken the previous night, hearing it again in the light of morning still sent a strange shiver through her, half comfort and half unfamiliarity. "I trust you slept adequately." "I did, Your Grace, thank you," she replied, settling into the chair he gestured toward. "Doran has spent the early hours reviewing his research, alongside what you told us last night," the Duke continued, returning to his own seat. "There are matters we must discuss, though I want you to understand that nothing that follows requires your immediate decision. You have time to consider your path forward." Elira nodded, bracing herself for whatever came next, though nothing could have fully prepared her for what Doran revealed. "Your Grace," Doran began, addressing the Duke, though his eyes moved frequently to Elira as he spoke. "In the months following the fall of House Thorn, the lands and holdings that belonged to your family were redistributed by royal decree, as is customary when a noble house is declared extinguished without surviving heirs." "Redistributed to whom?" Elira asked, though something in Doran's careful tone told her she would not like the answer. "The majority of the lands, along with the title itself in all but formal name, were granted to Baron Halric Fendrel," Doran said, watching Elira's reaction carefully as he spoke the name. Elira frowned, searching her memory for any recollection of the name, but found nothing. "I do not recognize that name," she said slowly. "Was he known to my father?" "Not closely, as far as my research shows," Doran replied. "Baron Fendral held modest lands to the east of your family's holdings, before the fall of House Thorn. His rise to prominence following your family's destruction was, by many accounts, remarkably swift and remarkably convenient." The Duke leaned forward slightly, his expression sharpening with the calculated focus Elira had already come to recognize. "Convenient enough," he said, "that I have long held quiet suspicions regarding the true cause of House Thorn's fall. Suspicions that Doran's research over the years has only strengthened, though we lack the proof, and more importantly, the surviving witness, to pursue the matter further." "You believe Baron Fendral orchestrated the attack on my family," Elira said, the words feeling strange and heavy as they left her mouth, though beneath the shock, something colder and more resolute was already beginning to take shape within her. "I believe it is possible," the Duke said carefully. "Possibility is not proof, and accusing a baron of such a crime without solid evidence would be reckless, particularly given the political influence Fendral has cultivated in the years since your family's fall. He has allied himself carefully with several powerful houses, making himself difficult to challenge without substantial cause." Elira sat with the information for a long moment, memories of the fire mixing uneasily with this new knowledge of a man she had never met, a man who may have taken everything from her while she spent 3 years believing her family's destruction had been nothing more than senseless tragedy. What proof would be needed? She asked finally, her voice steadier than she expected. That, the Duke said, is precisely what we must determine. Doran has gathered financial records suggesting unusual transactions around the time of the attack, payments made to parties whose identities remain unclear. If we can trace those payments to their source, we may find the proof required to bring Fendral's actions into the light. And until then, Alira said, he continues to hold lands and a title that should never have belonged to him, while I remain hidden here within your walls. Not hidden, the Duke corrected gently. Protected, until we determine the safest path forward. Fendral believes House Thorn was entirely destroyed. If word reaches him that an heir survives, and worse, that the heir is under my protection, he may act rashly to eliminate the threat before we have gathered sufficient proof against him. The weight of the danger settled over Alira, fully for the first time since arriving at the keep. She had spent 3 years believing herself forgotten, safe in her obscurity, precisely because no one cared enough to look for her. Now, within a single day, she had become the center of a conflict that could reshape the political landscape of the entire Northern Territory, and a target for a man powerful enough to have orchestrated the destruction of an entire noble house. There is something else you should know, Doran said, glancing toward the Duke as though seeking permission before continuing. At the Duke's small nod, he turned back to Alira. The records I have gathered suggest that not everyone within House Thorn's estate perished that night. Several bodies were never conclusively identified in the aftermath, including that of a young boy, matching the description of your brother. Alira's heart stopped. You believe my brother may still be alive, she said, barely able to breathe the words aloud. Hope and fear, tangled so tightly together, she could not separate one from the other. I believe it is possible, Doran said carefully, clearly wary of offering false hope. I do not have proof either way, but if he survived, as you did, it is possible he too has spent these years hidden, perhaps unaware of his own true identity, or too afraid to reveal it. Alira pressed her hands against her face, overwhelmed by the sudden collision of grief and hope that Doran's words had unleashed within her. She had mourned her brother for 3 years, had accepted his loss as one more piece of the life that had been taken from her that terrible night. The possibility that he might still be alive, somewhere, unaware of who he truly was, felt almost too fragile to hold on to. If he is alive, she said finally, lowering her hands and meeting the Duke's steady gaze, I want to find him. Whatever proof you need to bring against Baron Fendral, whatever risks that search requires, I want to find my brother. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into his expression. Then we will search, he said simply. But we will do so carefully and quietly, for both your sakes. Fendral must not learn of this until we are prepared to face him with proof, strong enough to withstand whatever influence he has built around himself. Alira nodded, steadying herself against the storm of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. And for the first time since the fire that had taken her family, she felt something within her shift from mere survival towards something greater. Somewhere beyond these walls, a man who had built his power on the ashes of her family's destruction believed himself entirely safe. He did not yet know that the last surviving heir of House Thorn had found her way into the protection of one of the most powerful men in the Northern Territory. Nor did he know that she intended to reclaim everything that had been taken from her, piece by piece, until nothing remained hidden and nothing remained unpunished. Word spread quickly through the keep that the Duke had brought a stranger north from Ashfell, though the full truth of her identity remained known only to the Duke, Doran, and Leora. To the rest of the household, and to the visiting nobles who frequently passed through the fortress on matters of trade and politics, Alira was simply an unexplained guest, dressed finely but carrying herself with the careful reserve of someone unaccustomed to the attention now surrounding her. The whispers began within days. They say the Duke found her begging in some forgotten market town. A noblewoman named Petra Ashdown murmured to her companion during an afternoon gathering in the keep's smaller receiving hall, her voice pitched just loud enough to ensure it carried to where Alira stood near a window, pretending not to hear. Begging, her companion repeated, clearly delighted by the scandal of it. And now she wears silk and dines at his table. What could possibly explain such generosity, unless the Duke has taken a sudden interest in charity work of a very particular kind? Alira kept her expression carefully neutral, though the insinuation in the woman's tone was unmistakable. She had endured mockery in Ashfell for years, but there was a different flavor to cruelty delivered in silk gloves and polite smiles, a sharper edge hidden beneath practiced courtesy. "I understand you arrived here under unusual circumstances," Petra said, turning her attention directly toward Alira now, her smile pleasant, but her eyes cold. "Forgive my curiosity, but the keep rarely hosts guests of such mysterious origin. Might I ask what exactly recommends you to the Duke's household?" "I am here as his guest," Alira replied evenly, refusing to let the tremor she felt internally reach her voice. "Beyond that, I have little else to share." "How curious," Petra said, exchanging a knowing look with her companion. "A guest with no name worth mentioning, no family worth naming, and no explanation for her sudden appearance at the Duke's side. One might almost think there was something worth hiding." Alira held her ground, though the words struck closer to truth than Petra could possibly have realized. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "not everything requires an explanation, offered for the entertainment of strangers." Petra's smile thinned slightly at the quiet rebuke, though she said nothing further, choosing instead to turn back to her companion and resume a conversation about an upcoming gathering planned for the following week, one to which, Alira noted, she had not been invited. She excused herself from the hall shortly after, retreating to the quiet of the study where Doran often worked, finding him bent over his papers as usual, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence. "You look troubled," Doran observed without looking up immediately from his work. "The other guests have taken an interest in my presence here," Alira admitted, settling into a chair near his desk. "An unkind interest, though I suppose I should have expected as much." Doran finally looked up, his expression sympathetic. "The nobility of this territory are rarely kind to those they do not yet understand," he said. "Once your identity is confirmed and made known, their attitudes will shift considerably, though I will not pretend the shift will always be for the better. Some will resent House Thorn's return to prominence, as much as they now mock its apparent absence. Then perhaps it would be simpler to remain as I am," Alira said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Unclaimed, unremarkable, free of whatever expectations come, with reclaiming a name I have spent years trying to forget." Doran set down his quill and studied her carefully. "Is that truly what you want?" he asked. "Or is it simply the fear speaking, the same fear that kept you hidden in Ashfell for 3 years?" Alira did not answer immediately, turning the question over in her mind. She thought of Petra's cold smile, of the whispers that would only grow louder once her true name became known, of the danger the Duke had warned might follow, should Baron Fendrel learn an heir of House Thorn still lived. And yet beneath all of that fear, she found something else stirring. Something that had been growing steadily since the night she first spoke her family's story aloud to the Duke. "I want the truth to matter," she said finally. "I want my parents' deaths to mean something beyond senseless tragedy. I want whoever destroyed my family to answer for it. I am simply afraid of what it will cost me to see that happen." "Then hold on to that reason," Doran said gently, "and let it carry you past the fear, the same way it has clearly carried you this far already." Before Alira could respond further, the study door opened, and the Duke entered, his expression tighter than usual, a folded letter clutched in one hand. "Your Grace," Doran said, straightening immediately. "Is something wrong?" The Duke closed the door behind him before answering, his eyes moving briefly to Alira before settling on his steward. "I have received word from a contact within Baron Fendrel's household," he said. "It seems rumors of a stranger arriving at my keep under unusual circumstances have already begun to travel further than I would have liked." Alira's stomach tightened. "Does he know who I am?" she asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice this time. "Not yet," the Duke said, though his expression offered little comfort. "But he has grown curious enough to send inquiries to several households, attempting to learn more about the guest I have taken in. Curiosity from a man like Fendrel rarely remains harmless for long." "Then we must move more quickly," Doran said, before his curiosity turns to suspicion. "Agreed," the Duke replied. "I have decided to hold a formal gathering here at the keep within the fortnight, ostensibly to discuss matters of trade along the northern roads. In truth, it will provide us an opportunity to observe how Fendrel and his allies react to Lady Alara's presence, once her identity can no longer remain entirely hidden." Elira felt a chill settle over her at the thought of standing before a room full of nobles, including allies of the very man suspected of destroying her family, with her true identity finally revealed. "You intend to reveal who I am at this gathering," she said slowly. "Not entirely, and not all at once," the Duke clarified. "But enough of the truth will need to surface to draw Fendral's attention directly, rather than allowing rumors and second-hand reports to shape his understanding of the situation. It is a risk, but one I believe necessary, if we are to gather the proof required to expose him fully." Elira thought of Petra Ashdown's cold smile, of the whispers already circulating through halls she had barely begun to navigate, and steadied herself against the fear threatening to close her throat entirely. She had survived 3 years of mockery and hunger in Ashfell. She had survived a fire that had taken her family from her. She would survive this as well, whatever the coming fortnight required of her. "Then let us prepare properly," she said, straightening in her chair, something resolute settling into her expression that had not been there when she first arrived at the keep. "If Baron Fendral wishes to look more closely at the guest hidden within these walls, then perhaps it is time he finally sees exactly what and who he is looking at." The Duke's eyes met hers across the room, something like approval flickering across his composed features. "Lady Alara Thorne," he said quietly, "I believe you may prove far more formidable than Baron Fendral currently understands." Elira allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile, the first genuine one she had felt in longer than she could remember, as the weight of fear slowly began transforming, piece by piece, into something closer to determination. Preparation for the gathering consumed the following days, though much of the true work happened away from the eyes of the household, in the quiet hours before dawn, when Doran and the Duke pored over records seeking any thread that might lead them closer to proof against Baron Fendral. Elira, unable to sleep through the tension building within her, often found herself joining them, poring over ledgers and correspondence, long after Leora had retired for the night. "Here," Doran said one evening, several days before the planned gathering, tapping a finger against a weathered ledger spread open on the desk before him. "A payment recorded 3 years ago, made from an account associated with Baron Fendral to an unnamed party, described only as compensation for services rendered along the eastern border. That alone proves nothing," the Duke said, though he leaned closer to examine the entry himself. "Fendral conducts business along the eastern border regularly. A single payment could relate to any number of legitimate transactions." "True," Doran agreed, "but the timing is notable. This payment was made only 4 days before the attack on House Thorn. And here," he continued, flipping to another page marked with a small ribbon, "a second payment, considerably larger, made to the same unnamed party, less than a week after the attack, described as final settlement." Elira leaned over the ledger herself, studying the careful script recording numbers and dates that meant little to her untrained eye, though the pattern Doran had identified was clear enough even to her. "Final settlement for what?" she asked quietly. "That," the Duke said grimly, "is precisely what we need to determine before the gathering, if at all possible." Doran straightened, removing his spectacles briefly to rub at tired eyes. "There is another path we might pursue," he said. "During my research into House Thorn's fall, I came across mention of a servant who worked within your family's household, Your Grace, a woman named Sable who managed the kitchens. Records suggest she left the estate's service shortly before the attack, taking a position instead within a merchant household some distance to the south." Elira's breath caught. "Sable," she repeated, the name stirring a distant memory of a kind older woman who used to slip her extra sweets when her mother was not looking, who had taught her simple songs while she sat on a stool in the kitchen, watching bread rise near the hearth. "I remember her. She left our household not long before everything happened. If she is still alive," Doran said carefully, "she may have information regarding the circumstances of her departure, information that could prove valuable in understanding whether Baron Fendral had already begun making arrangements before the attack occurred." "Where does she live now?" Elira asked, hope kindling despite her attempts to remain cautious. "According to the most recent records I could locate, a small village named Oakbrend, roughly 2 days' ride from here," Doran replied. The Duke considered this for a long moment, weighing the risks carefully. Sending riders to question her openly could draw unwanted attention if word reaches Fendral's allies, he said finally. But a quiet visit, conducted with discretion, might yield answers we sorely need before the gathering. "Send me," Elira said immediately, surprising even herself with the certainty in her voice. Both men turned to look at her, and the Duke's expression shifted into something cautious. "That would carry considerable risk," he said, "if anyone recognized you." "No one in Oakbrand would recognize me," Elira interrupted gently. "I have spent 3 years learning how to become someone unremarkable, Your Grace. I know how to move through a village unnoticed, better than any soldier you might send in my place. And if Sable is indeed the woman I remember, she may speak more openly to a familiar face than to strangers asking questions on your behalf." The Duke studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between the practical wisdom of her argument and his evident reluctance to place her in danger. "I will accompany you myself then," he said finally, "along with a small guard, dressed as common travelers rather than soldiers of my household. We cannot afford for word to spread that the Duke himself has taken sudden interest in a retired kitchen servant from a fallen noble house." Doran nodded his agreement, already making notes regarding the arrangements that would need to be made for such a journey to pass unnoticed. 2 days later, dressed in simple traveling clothes with her hair covered by a plain hood, Elira rode alongside the Duke and 2 of his most trusted guards along the southern road toward Oakbrand, the fortress, and its whispered rumors falling behind them. The journey passed largely in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by quiet conversation about the village ahead and the questions they hoped to answer once they arrived. "You seem different since arriving at the keep," the Duke observed at one point, as their horses moved at an easy pace along the quiet road. "I have had little choice but to become different," Elira replied honestly. "For 3 years, I survived by making myself as small and unremarkable as possible, hoping no one would look closely enough to see anything worth noticing. Now it seems, I must learn to be seen clearly again, and to withstand whatever comes with that." "It suits you," the Duke said simply, and something in the quiet sincerity of his tone caused a warmth to spread through Elira's chest that she did not entirely understand, nor did she examine it too closely. They reached Oakbrand as the sun began to set on the 2nd day of travel, a small village nestled among gentle hills, its cottages arranged around a modest central square. Doran's information led them to a cottage at the village's edge, where an elderly woman with silver hair sat outside shelling peas into a wooden bowl, her hands moving with the practiced ease of long habit. Elira dismounted and approached slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and nervous anticipation. The woman looked up as she drew near, her eyes narrowing slightly with the natural wariness of someone unaccustomed to strangers approaching her home. "Sable," Elira said softly, and the woman's hands stilled instantly, the bowl of peas nearly slipping from her lap. "That is not a name I have heard spoken aloud in many years," the old woman said carefully, studying Elira's face with sudden, sharp attention. "Who are you, child, to know it?" Elira reached up and lowered the hood covering her hair, allowing the fading evening light to fall fully across her features. "You used to slip me sweets in the kitchen," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion she could no longer hold back. "You taught me a song about a fox and a river, though I never could remember all the words." The old woman's eyes widened, the bowl of peas finally tumbling from her lap entirely, as she rose unsteadily to her feet, one trembling hand reaching out toward Elira's face, as though needing to confirm with touch what her eyes struggled to believe. "Little Lady Alara," Sable whispered, tears already gathering in her eyes. "Sweet stars above, I thought you perished with the rest of them. I thought I had lost you along with everyone else that terrible night." "I survived," Elira said softly, taking the old woman's trembling hand in both of her own. "And I have come seeking answers about what happened, before the fire took everything from us. Please, if you know anything at all, I need to hear it." Sable's expression shifted from joyful disbelief into something graver, glancing nervously toward the Duke and his guards waiting a respectful distance away, before drawing Elira closer and lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "I left your family's service only a week before the attack," she said quietly. "Not by choice, child. I was dismissed suddenly, without proper explanation, along with 2 other servants who had worked in your household for many years. At the time, I believed it simply the whims of a new steward your father had recently hired. But now, knowing what came after, I have long suspected there was a darker reason behind our sudden removal." "A new steward," Elira repeated slowly, exchanging a glance with the Duke, who had moved closer, listening intently to every word. "Yes," Sable confirmed. "A man named Corwin, hired only weeks before the attack, on the recommendation of a business associate your father had recently taken on. I never trusted him, though your father seemed to have no reason for suspicion at the time. Looking back, I have often wondered whether his sudden appearance within your household, and our equally sudden dismissal, was no coincidence at all." The Duke's expression had grown sharp with focused attention. "Do you recall the name of the business associate who recommended this steward?" he asked carefully. Sable's brow furrowed in thought, reaching back through years of memory. "I believe," she said slowly, "the name was Fendrall. Baron Halric Fendrall." Alira felt the confirmation settle over her like a physical weight, the final piece needed to connect suspicion into certainty. Baron Fendrall had placed someone within her family's household in the weeks before the attack, someone whose presence had conveniently coincided with the sudden dismissal of servants who might have proven inconvenient witnesses to whatever preparations had been quietly made. "Thank you," Alira said, gripping Sable's hands tightly, gratitude and fury mingling within her in equal measure. "You have given us exactly what we came seeking." As she and the Duke rode back toward the keep the following morning, the weight of Sable's testimony settling firmly alongside the financial records Doran had already uncovered, Alira felt the last remnants of doubt regarding Baron Fendral's guilt dissolve entirely. The proof was forming, piece by piece, thread by careful thread, and soon, she knew, there would be nowhere left for the man who had destroyed her family to hide from the truth finally rising to meet him. The night of the gathering arrived swiftly, the great hall of the keep transformed, with long tables draped in fine cloth, candles burning in every corner, and musicians playing softly near the hearth as nobles from across the northern territory filtered through the doors in their finest garments. Alira stood in her chamber, watching Leora fasten the final clasp of a deep green gown, her reflection in the mirror looking every bit the lady she had once been born to become. "You look every part a noblewoman," Leora said softly, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "No one seeing you tonight would ever guess the years you spent in Ashfell." "I hope you are right," Alira murmured, though nervousness churned steadily in her stomach. "Tonight determines whether Baron Fendrall begins to suspect the truth, or dismisses me as nothing more than an unusual guest." "The Duke will be at your side," Leora reminded her gently. "Whatever happens tonight, you will not face it alone." Alira nodded, drawing strength from the reminder, and made her way down toward the great hall, where the gathering had already begun to swell with arriving guests. She spotted Petra Ashdown near one of the long tables, engaged in animated conversation with several other nobles, and steadied herself against the anticipation of whatever cruel curiosity the evening might bring. The Duke met her near the entrance to the hall, dressed in formal dark robes trimmed with silver that matched the crest of his house, his expression composed, though his eyes held a flicker of something warmer as he took in her appearance. "You are ready for this," he said quietly, though it sounded more like reassurance than question. "I have survived worse evenings than this one," Alira replied, managing a small smile despite her nerves. Together they entered the hall, and conversation dimmed noticeably as heads turned to observe the Duke's mysterious guest walking openly at his side for the first time since her arrival. Whispers followed in their wake, though Alira kept her chin lifted, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of curious stares the way she might once have done in the market square of Ashfell. "Your Grace," Petra Ashdown said smoothly, approaching with practiced grace, her eyes sharp as she studied Alira from head to toe. "How wonderful that your mysterious guest has finally joined us properly. I confess I have been quite curious to learn more about her." "Lady Petra," the Duke replied evenly, "allow me to formally introduce my guest to the assembled company this evening, once all have gathered." Petra's smile tightened slightly at the deliberate delay, though she offered a gracious nod before returning to her circle of companions, no doubt eager to spread whatever fragments of information she managed to gather throughout the remainder of the evening. The hall continued filling with guests, and Alira noted with quiet unease the arrival of a broad-shouldered man, dressed in deep burgundy robes, a heavy signet ring gleaming on his hand, as he greeted several other nobles with practiced charm. Doran, standing near the edge of the hall, caught Alira's eye briefly and gave the smallest of nods, confirming what she had already suspected. Baron Halric Fendrall had arrived. Alira studied him from a careful distance, searching for some trace of villainy she expected to find, etched into his features, though he appeared, disappointingly and unsettlingly, entirely ordinary. A man in his middle years, silver beginning to thread through dark hair, his smile easy and his manner charming as he moved through the gathered nobility with the confidence of someone accustomed to being liked and respected wherever he traveled. He does not appear the sort capable of destroying an entire noble house, Elira murmured quietly to the Duke as they observed him from across the hall. Villains rarely announce themselves through appearance alone, the Duke replied grimly. Fendral has spent years cultivating exactly the reputation you now observe, precisely so that no one would think to question him. As the evening progressed, the Duke called the gathered nobility to attention, standing near the great hearth with a raised goblet, the hall quieting gradually as all eyes turned toward him. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "I thank you all for joining me this evening to discuss matters of trade along our northern roads, and to enjoy an evening of good company before winter closes the passes once more." Polite applause followed, and the Duke continued, his tone shifting subtly as he prepared to introduce the true purpose lurking beneath the evening's stated occasion. "Many of you have noticed a new guest within my household these past weeks," he continued, and Elira felt every eye in the hall turn toward her once more. Fr's gaze sharp with anticipation, Fendral's expression polite but attentive. "I confess, I have kept the full details of her presence here private until now, out of respect for circumstances that required careful and quiet investigation, before I could speak of them openly." The hall fell into complete silence, every guest hanging on the Duke's next words. Elira felt her pulse quicken, aware that whatever the Duke chose to reveal now would set into motion events that could not be undone. "Some years ago," the Duke continued, his gaze sweeping deliberately across the assembled nobility before settling, briefly and pointedly, on Baron Fendral. "A noble house of considerable standing within this territory was destroyed under circumstances that were, at the time, attributed entirely to misfortune and violence without clear cause. It was reported that no survivors remained." Murmurs rippled through the hall, several nobles exchanging uneasy glances, clearly beginning to sense the direction of the Duke's speech. Fendral's expression remained composed, though Elira, watching closely, thought she detected the faintest tightening around his eyes. "I have since learned," the Duke said, his voice growing quieter, but somehow carrying further for it, "that this belief was mistaken. A survivor remains, one who has spent years, hidden from a world that believed her already lost, until circumstances brought her back within my protection." Every eye in the hall turned toward Elira with renewed intensity, and she felt the weight of their collective attention pressing against her like a physical force. She lifted her chin and met their stares directly, refusing to let the years of mockery in Ashfell's market square define how she carried herself in this moment. "I do not intend to reveal the full details of this matter tonight," the Duke continued, "as certain aspects remain under careful investigation. But I felt it only proper that those gathered here understand that appearances and official reports do not always reflect the entirety of truth." He raised his goblet once more, and the hall, though clearly buzzing with unspoken questions, followed his lead in a toast whose true meaning only a handful of people present fully understood. As conversation resumed around the hall, considerably more animated than before, Elira noticed Baron Fendral excusing himself quietly from his circle of companions, moving toward a quieter corner of the hall, his expression troubled in a way it had not been only moments earlier. "He suspects," Elira murmured to the Duke as they moved together through the crowd, accepting congratulations and curious inquiries with practiced diplomacy. "He suspects something," the Duke agreed quietly. "Whether he yet suspects the full truth remains to be seen. But we have set events into motion tonight that cannot easily be undone. Whatever comes next, we must be prepared to face it." Later, as the gathering began to wind down and guests slowly departed into the cold night, Doran approached the Duke and Elira with an expression of quiet urgency. "Your Grace," he said in a low voice, "one of the kitchen staff reports that Baron Fendral's personal attendant was seen asking unusual questions among the household servants this evening, questions specifically regarding your guest's arrival and the circumstances surrounding it." The Duke's expression darkened. "It seems," he said grimly, that Baron Fendral does not intend to wait patiently for whatever truth we choose to reveal in our own time. Alira felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the cold night air seeping through the hall's tall windows. The careful plan she and the Duke had built together, gathering proof slowly and deliberately, now felt suddenly fragile against the urgency of a man who clearly understood, on some level, that the ground beneath his years of stolen power had begun, finally, to shift. 3 days after the gathering, a messenger arrived at the keep bearing an urgent letter sealed with the royal insignia, summoning Duke Cassian Voss and any relevant parties to appear before the regional court within the week, to address what the letter vaguely described as matters concerning the disputed inheritance of House Thorne's former holdings. "He has moved quickly," Doran said grimly, reading the letter over the Duke's shoulder in the study. "Fendral must have petitioned the court himself, seeking to resolve the matter of your claim, before we are fully prepared to present our evidence. He hopes to control the narrative before we can present ours," the Duke agreed, his jaw tightening. "If he stands before the court first, framing you as an impostor seeking to claim lands and title through false pretense, he may sway judgment before we ever have the chance to speak." Alira, seated near the window, felt her hands tighten in her lap. "Then we must ensure our evidence is ready before that hearing," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. "Sable's testimony, the financial records, the ring itself. Surely that is enough." "It may be enough to raise serious doubt," Doran said carefully. "Whether it is enough to fully condemn a baron as influential as Fendral before the regional court remains uncertain. He has cultivated powerful allies over the years, judges among them." The days leading to the hearing passed in a blur of preparation, Doran organizing every document with meticulous care, the Duke sending quiet inquiries to allies whose testimony might strengthen their position, and Alira practicing, again and again, the account of that terrible night, until she could recite it steadily, without her voice breaking, though the memories themselves never grew any easier to carry. On the evening before they were due to depart for the regional court, Leora came to Alira's chamber with an expression of poorly hidden worry. "There is something you should know," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. "One of the stable hands reported strange riders passing near the keep's outer boundary earlier tonight, moving with unusual caution, as though attempting to avoid notice." Alira's stomach dropped. "You believe they were sent by Fendral," she said, though it was hardly a question. "I do not know for certain," Leora admitted, "but given the timing, so close to the hearing, it seems an unwise coincidence to ignore." Alira found the Duke in the study, already aware of the report, his expression grave, as he studied a map of the surrounding lands spread across his desk. "If Fendral has sent men to watch the keep," he said, without looking up as she entered, "it likely means he fears what we might present before the court and hopes to prevent us from arriving at all." "Then we should leave immediately," Alira said, "before he has the chance to act on whatever he intends." The Duke considered this, then nodded slowly. "We will depart before dawn, taking a lesser-used road rather than the main route, along with additional guards. It will add time to our journey, but it may also keep us safely ahead of whatever Fendral hopes to arrange." They left the keep in darkness, the small convoy moving quietly along a narrow forest road that wound through hills far from the main trade route most travelers would expect them to use. Alira rode close beside the Duke, her nerves stretched taut with every unfamiliar sound echoing through the trees around them, every distant call of a night bird sending her heart racing with sudden alarm. They were perhaps halfway through the second day of travel when the ambush came. Riders emerged suddenly from the trees lining both sides of the narrow road, moving with the coordinated precision of men who had planned their positions carefully in advance. The Duke's guards reacted instantly, forming a protective barrier around Alira and the Duke, while shouts of alarm rang through the forest. "Stay close to me," the Duke said sharply, his own blade drawn, his horse maneuvering protectively beside Alira's own frightened mount. The confrontation was brief but tense, the Duke's well-trained guards proving more than capable of holding the ambushing riders at bay, though several tense minutes passed before the attackers, realizing they were outmatched and outnumbered, withdrew back into the trees as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind only the sound of retreating hooves and the ragged breathing of those left standing in the clearing. "Is everyone accounted for?" the Duke called out, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. One of the guards, a young man named Corin, reported a shallow wound along his forearm, already being tended by a companion, but otherwise, the convoy remained unharmed, shaken but intact. That was no random band of thieves, the Duke said grimly. Once the immediate danger had passed, and the convoy resumed its cautious journey, those riders knew exactly which road we traveled, despite our efforts to keep our route quiet. Fendral has eyes within your household, Alira said, the realization settling over her with cold certainty. Someone reported our movements to him. The Duke's expression darkened further at the thought, though he said nothing more on the matter until they finally arrived, shaken but safe, at the regional court 2 days later, the grand building rising before them with its tall pillars and imposing presence, guards stationed at every entrance in preparation for the hearing that would determine the fate of House Thorne's stolen legacy. Inside the Great Hall of Judgment, nobles and officials from across the territory had already gathered, drawn by rumors of the unusual case about to be heard. Baron Fendral stood near the front of the assembly, dressed in formal robes of deep burgundy, his expression composed and confident as he greeted several judges with practiced familiarity that spoke of years spent cultivating exactly these relationships. Duke Voss, Fendral said smoothly as they entered, his smile polite, though his eyes carried a sharp edge Alira had not noticed during the gathering at the keep. And this must be the mysterious guest, whose claim has brought us all here today. I confess, I am most curious to hear the details of her story. You will hear them soon enough, Baron, the Duke replied evenly, offering nothing further as they took their positions before the assembled judges. The presiding judge, an elderly man with sharp eyes and a reputation for careful impartiality, called the hearing to order, and the great hall fell into expectant silence. We are gathered today, the judge announced, to address a claim brought before this court concerning the disputed inheritance of lands and title, formerly belonging to House Thorne, presently held by Baron Halric Fendral, under royal decree, following the reported extinction of the Thorne family line, 3 years past. Duke Voss, you may present your case. The Duke rose, and beside him, Alira felt every eye in the great hall settle upon her once more, the weight of the moment pressing down with an intensity greater than anything she had faced in the market square of Ashfell, greater even than the fear she had carried since the night of the fire. Whatever happened within these walls today would determine not only her own fate, but the truth of everything that had been taken from her family, and whether the man who had orchestrated their destruction would finally be made to answer for it. Honored judges, the Duke began, his voice steady and clear, carrying easily through the silent hall. I present before you Lady Alara Thorne, sole surviving heir of House Thorne, and I intend to demonstrate, through testimony and evidence gathered these past weeks, that the destruction of her family was no random act of misfortune, but a deliberate scheme, orchestrated for the benefit of the very man who now stands to inherit everything her family once possessed. A wave of gasps and murmurs swept through the hall, and Baron Fendral's composed expression flickered, just for a moment, into something far less certain, before he schooled his features back into practiced calm, though not quickly enough to escape the notice of everyone watching closely, including the sharp-eyed judges seated before them. The truth, buried for 3 long years beneath fire and fear and careful silence, was finally about to be spoken aloud before those with the power to act upon it. Doran stepped forward at the Duke's signal, carrying the leather folder that held weeks of careful research, and began presenting the evidence methodically to the assembled judges. He described the financial records showing 2 suspicious payments made from Baron Fendral's accounts in the days surrounding the attack on House Thorne, the first labeled only as compensation for unspecified services, the second, larger payment made shortly after the estate's destruction, described simply as final settlement. These records alone prove only unusual spending, Baron Fendral interjected smoothly, though a thin note of tension had crept into his otherwise confident voice. A baron of my standing conducts countless transactions. Coincidental timing does not constitute evidence of wrongdoing. Perhaps not alone, the Duke replied calmly, but combined with further testimony, the pattern becomes considerably harder to dismiss as mere coincidence. Doran then described Sable's account, the sudden dismissal of longtime household servants in the weeks before the attack, replaced by a steward named Corwin, who had come recommended specifically by Baron Fendral himself. Murmurs rippled through the hall once more. several judges exchanging troubled glances as the pieces began assembling into a picture too coherent to easily explain away. "Where is this steward now?" one of the judges asked sharply, addressing Fendrel directly. Surely he could clarify the nature of his recommendation and his role within House Thorne's household before its destruction. Fendral's composure slipped further, a bead of sweat forming at his temple, despite the cool air of the great hall. "I have not maintained contact with him since. I could not say where he might presently be found." "How convenient," the Duke observed quietly, though loud enough for the judges to hear, "that the one man who might confirm or deny the connection between your household and House Thorne's has simply disappeared." The judge presiding over the hearing turned his sharp gaze toward Alira herself. "Lady Alara," he said, his tone gentler than the formal proceedings might have suggested, "this court would hear your own account of the events in question, if you are willing to share it." Alira rose slowly, her heart pounding, aware of every eye in the great hall fixed upon her, aware most acutely of Baron Fendral's gaze, sharp and calculating despite his outward composure. She thought of her mother's hand gripping hers as they ran through smoke-filled corridors, of her brother's small fingers intertwined with her mother's other hand, of the ring resting now openly around her neck rather than hidden beneath her collar. She told her story clearly and steadily, the same account she had given the Duke on her first night at the keep, though now spoken with the strength of someone who had spent weeks preparing to be believed rather than dismissed. She described the soldiers moving through smoke-filled halls, the servants' passage her father had once shown her as a simple game, the moment she had looked back and seen what she could never fully describe aloud, the long separation from her brother in the darkness of the forest. By the time she finished, several among the assembled nobility had visibly softened, sympathy evident on faces that had approached the hearing with only curious skepticism. Even some of the judges appeared moved by the account, though the presiding judge maintained his careful neutrality, mindful of the weight his eventual judgment would carry. "This is a tragic account," Baron Fendral said, recovering some of his composure, "but grief and tragedy alone do not prove wrongdoing on my part. Perhaps this woman has been misled, or worse, coached by those who might benefit from casting suspicion upon a baron whose lands and title they wish to see disputed." "Misled," the Duke repeated coldly. "Or perhaps simply correct, Baron, in ways you find deeply inconvenient." Before Fendral could respond further, the great doors at the rear of the hall opened, and a commotion rippled through the assembled crowd as a figure entered, escorted by two of the Duke's guards who had remained behind at the keep during the journey to the hearing. Alira turned, along with everyone else in the hall, and felt her breath catch entirely at the sight of the man being led forward. It was Corwin, the missing steward, his expression pale and frightened, clearly having been located and brought to the hearing under circumstances he had not anticipated. "Your Grace," one of the guards announced, "we found this man attempting to leave the territory entirely, using false papers under a different name. Given the urgency of the hearing, we thought it best to bring him directly." Gasps and murmurs swept through the hall once more, and Baron Fendral's face drained of color entirely, all pretense of calm confidence abandoning him at once. "Corwin," the presiding judge said sharply, "you stand before this court in a matter of grave importance. Will you speak truthfully of your role within House Thorne's household, and of who recommended your position there?" Corwin's eyes darted nervously toward Fendral, then back toward the judges, clearly weighing the danger of speaking against the danger of remaining silent. Finally, his shoulders sagged, and something like relief, mixed with fear, crossed his features as he began to speak. "Baron Fendral recommended me for the position," he admitted, his voice trembling. "He instructed me to arrange the dismissal of several longtime servants, citing concerns about their loyalty, though I now understand the true purpose was to remove witnesses who might have noticed unusual activity in the days before the attack. I did not know, Your Honors. I swear before you, exactly what was being planned. I was told only that certain arrangements needed to be made quietly, and that my silence would be well compensated." "And the payments?" the judge pressed. "The ones described in the financial records presented before this court. What do you know of them?" "The first payment secured my silence and cooperation," Corwin said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "The second, I believe, was payment to those who carried out the attack itself, mercenaries hired through channels I was never permitted to fully understand. I fled shortly after, fearing what I had become part of, and have hidden ever since, afraid of what would happen should the truth ever come to light." The great hall erupted into a storm of shocked voices, and Baron Fendrel, finally abandoning all pretense of innocence, rose from his seat, with a face contorted by fury and desperation. "This man is lying," he shouted, though the desperation in his voice betrayed the hollowness of the denial. "He speaks only to save himself from whatever punishment he fears, inventing lies to shift blame onto—" "Enough," the presiding judge said sharply, his voice cutting through Fendrel's protests with absolute authority. "This court has heard sufficient testimony and evidence to warrant immediate further investigation into your affairs, Baron Fendrel, and pending the outcome of that investigation, your claim to the lands and title of House Thorn is hereby suspended in full." Fendrel's face went ashen, his earlier confidence collapsing entirely beneath the weight of exposed truth, and guards moved forward at the judge's signal to escort him from the hall for formal questioning, his protests growing fainter as he was led away. The powerful baron who had orchestrated the destruction of an entire noble house, finally facing the consequences of his actions, after 3 long years of believing himself entirely safe. The judge turned then toward Alira, his expression softening considerably. "Lady Alara Thorn," he said formally, "pending final review of these proceedings, this court recognizes your claim as rightful heir to House Thorn, and moves to restore to you the lands and title, unjustly taken, through fraudulent and criminal means." The great hall filled with applause and murmured congratulations, and Alira stood in stunned silence for a long moment, overwhelmed by the sudden, complete transformation of everything she had believed about her own life only weeks earlier. She turned to the Duke, who watched her with an expression of quiet pride, and something warmer still, something that had grown steadily between them, through weeks of shared purpose and careful trust. In the months that followed, House Thorn slowly rebuilt itself under Alira's careful guidance. The ancestral lands returned fully to her name, the household restored with the help of servants like Sable, who returned gladly to serve the family she had once believed lost forever. Search efforts for her brother continued quietly, guided by clues Doran had uncovered, offering a fragile thread of hope that Alira refused to abandon. Duke Cassian Voss remained close throughout the rebuilding, his support becoming something far more personal than mere political alliance, a bond forged through shared danger and quiet understanding that neither of them had expected to find, yet both had come to treasure deeply. Standing once more in the gardens of Thorn Hall, rebuilt now from the ashes of tragedy, Alira touched the ring that had once been her only connection to a life she believed forever lost, and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 long years, to imagine a future built not on survival alone, but on justice reclaimed, family remembered, and a new beginning finally within her reach.